When lost dogs, companion animals, end up in shelters, the last thing you want to see is that dog end up as a lab specimen. But in Louisiana, LSU Vet School was doing just that, taking shelter dogs and using them for research, until a whistleblower came to PETA. That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, LSU Vet School exposed using dogs from shelters for experiments.
Some of the dogs had collars who were sold to Louisiana State University. So, obviously these were people's pets. And to this day, they may not know what happened to their dog. They may not know that they wound up in a laboratory. And that kind of makes people's stomachs turn to think that if my dog gets out of my fence or out of my yard, that I have to worry that they're going to be sold to Louisiana State University Veterinary School for a lethal anatomy lab. That shouldn't be an anxiety that's on people's minds at all when they're already dealing with the incredible stress of losing their companion animal.
PETA's Jeremy Beckham of the Laboratory Investigations Department on how LSU Vet School has purchased at least 70 live dogs in 2018 alone from a shelter in Baton Rouge, and all of it documented by the now former executive director of the shelter, Companion Animal Alliance, who came to PETA and blew the whistle on the practice. Now those involved could be in trouble after PETA filed complaints with both the USDA and the district attorney in Baton Rouge. Beckham explains how the whistleblower sent PETA into action. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 55, the second show of what we're calling our second season. Please share a link with your friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to here on the PETA Podcast. Month 1 of your New Year resolution to go vegan went well, but not maybe month 2? Find out how PETA's vegan mentors are here to help you. Episode 25. Still wondering about your Canada Goose jacket? You can ditch it and still say warm, toasty, and vegan. Listen to episode 44. And for more on animal testing, listen how scientists have turned it into their own welfare system in episode 11. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes. We'd love to hear your feedback. Just click on that. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Sometimes whistleblowers are the important link in PETA's fight to save animals. So much is done behind closed doors that without someone to blow the whistle, abuses continue unchecked. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at the Companion Animal Alliance shelter, a former executive director had seen enough and provided PETA with documents showing the shelter was providing LSU Vet School with more than 70 live dogs. Ostensibly adopted, the school was buying them to be research subjects, not companion animals. And it's against the law. Certainly the Animal Welfare Act, on the books since the 60s, and quite possibly a matter for the local DA's office to criminally prosecute. I talked to PETA's Jeremy Beckham about how the case developed and where it's going on the PETA Podcast.
We first got a communication in October of last year from a woman who said that she was recently fired as the executive director of an animal shelter in Louisiana. And the main reason she was fired was she no longer wanted the shelter to supply live animals to Louisiana State University for use in experimentation and training exercises.
When you get something like this is kind of a jaw dropper. So what goes through your mind when you see this?
As tragic as this may sound, it's not too uncommon that we get jaw-dropping information passed along to us. So what we have to do, we have to take that outrage and that shock over the information we're hearing, and we have to, in a very methodical way, corroborate the information as best as we can, because as you know, there are many people out there who are skeptical or very resistant to really what the animal rights movement is trying to accomplish and what PETA is trying to accomplish. And they will find any sort of loophole or inaccuracy, unintentional or otherwise, to discredit the whole effort. So the first thing we do is we take the allegations and we see what we can corroborate independently as best as we can before we make a public case, because we want to make sure the information is as accurate as possible.
You could be jacked around by someone who's trying to give you false information as well, right?
Yes. In fact, we're almost certain that that's happened before. In other contexts, for example, you had SeaWorld, who basically hired a spy or an agent provocateur to embed himself in the organization and try to get us to do things that would come back to harm the organization. And similarly, we are almost certain there have been many times we've suspected this has happened, but we didn't act on it responsibly, where people have passed along false information in hopes that we'll wind up amplifying it to discredit ourselves, or maybe they're trying to use us as some sort of leverage against a competitor. You never know. So I think, when you're in the position of a large organization like PETA is, you have to take the information and vet it. And that's really the first thing we did is we, obviously we listen with an open mind and an open ear, but we do our best to thoroughly vet it and see what we can independently corroborate.
The point is that PETA takes these things seriously and is responsible. You get this claim that someone has made that LSU is buying these dogs from a shelter. You corroborate it independently, and then what happened?
We took advantage of the fact that Louisiana State University is a public university. And when you're a public university, you're subject to your state's open records laws. So the first thing I did was I submitted an open records request, on behalf of PETA. And what we were looking for was any kind of internal communications the Louisiana State University staff or personnel may have had about this issue, as well as information pertaining to the specific dogs involved. The information that the whistleblower gave us indicated that 70 dogs, at least 70 dogs, were sold to Louisiana State University in 2018 for use in research and teaching. And, I want to stress that, she and at this point, really, no one knows exactly what these animals were even being used for. The shelter never really asked or demanded to know. It appears that at least most of them are being used in a deadly anatomy training laboratory, though we wanted to try to learn a little bit more about how the Louisiana State University was acquiring these animals, what they planned to do with them, how many animals were involved, a lot of those basic facts. So that was how we sought to corroborate it.
And so how many dogs total were funneled through this shelter to LSU? You said 70 in 2018 alone. How far back does it go? How many dogs do you think were involved?
So the records we got also from Louisiana State University show that Louisiana State University was purchasing both live animals and cadavers. And when it comes to cadavers, we know they were buying cadavers from a few different shelters in the area. And then when it comes to live animals, we know they purchased at least 70 in 2018. And then it appeared that there was a gap of maybe a couple years when they purchased more back in like 2015. So we kind of zeroed in on these animals that they had recently purchased because it kind of showed a new upward trend. And all of those animals these live animals came from this shelter that the whistleblower was fired from, the Companion Animal Alliance in Baton Rouge.
And so now that you know this was real, first of all, how do you determine what's a violation? For people who don't work with this all the time, getting a live animal from a shelter, even a cadaver from a source, it doesn't sound like it would be that bad. Is there a law that says you can't do it, or something that prevents them from selling an animal to for research?
So it turns out that it is illegal, and that's one of the first questions that we ask ourselves whenever we get troubling information about a laboratory or really anywhere else that's abusing an animal. Is PETA runs it through, I guess you could call it sort of a little checklist. And one of the first questions we ask is we work closely with our legal team as well as people within Laboratory Investigations Department who are just aware or have an expertise in this area of law. We ask, does this comply with both federal and state laws? And then, we also ask, How can we get the public's attention to this? Do we have any reporters who we know in this area are interested in animal protection issues? These are all questions that we'll ask ourselves whenever we want to make a public case about an issue. And so I took a look at the records and I compared it to the Animal Welfare Act, which is the only federal law that protects animals in laboratories. And it does a very poor job at protecting animals in laboratories. But it turns out that even this poor, weak excuse of a law does have some pretty strong provisions when it comes to acquiring live dogs and cats. And I think it's really important for the listeners out there to understand the historical context as to why these protections are so strong. The Animal Welfare Act originally became a law in 1966, and it became a law on the heels of all of this reporting about the fact that people were going to shelters, going to auctions, even stealing people's dogs out of yards and selling them to laboratories. So laboratories were getting their hands on people's lost and stolen pets frequently. So they passed this law to try to stop that practice. And now it says that laboratories have to purchase dogs and cats from a USDA licensed source, either a breeder or a dealer that is licensed by the USDA, and subjects itself to USDA inspections and all of that.
Jeremy, what was the purpose of that? I mean, to get it from a licensed USDA place, did they want to make sure that if these dogs were going to be experimented on, that they were, healthy, or what was their thinking? Because it wasn't done for the humaneness of their treatment, or was it?
That's right. Yeah, and the reality is, a dog, no matter where they came from, feels the same pain that we all do, or that feels the same pain as any other dog. So in some ways, these distinctions are artificial. But the reason the law does make that distinction was the law was responding to a public outcry where people were worried that their dog or their cat in their home might wind up, on a laboratory table being cut open alive or something like that. And so there was this strong outcry saying we have to make sure that laboratories, if they're going to torture, abuse, and kill animals, that at least it's not my animal. And that's why those protections, became so strong. And when you have a USDA licensed breeder or dealer, those breeders and dealers have to agree to a bunch of regulations on them that concern individual sourcing and tracebacks of those animals. So when the USDA inspector visits one of these breeders, they can say, tell me where you got this dog from. And that breeder has to produce a record that says, here was the person who bred the dog, or I bred the dog myself, so that they could make sure they understood the source of every one of the dogs and cats that winds up in a laboratory. Now, of course, when you buy from a shelter, though, that's pretty much impossible to do.
Yeah. Well, was there perhaps maybe also some kind of black market for dogs, people stealing dogs, or people, in the same way that people might kidnap a dog and then, sell it to an experimenter source? Did that ever happen?
It did. So there's this industry called the Class B dealer industry. And I urge, any listener to go onto PETA's website and read about Class B dealers. This used to be a larger industry than it is now, but there is still a very small Class B dealer industry. And Class B dealers are so-called random source dealers, where they procure dogs and cats from random places. Sometimes it's free to good home ads. I've seen a past case I worked on several years ago where someone just went to a Walmart parking lot and bought some puppies from the back of a truck, and those dogs wound up at a laboratory. And so often, because there's this financial incentive to just sell as many dogs as you can, these people wind up taking dogs from people's yards, taking dogs who are lost, and rather than taking them to a shelter, they turn around and sell them to a laboratory. And that is what this law was, the original purpose of the law was to combat that problem.
So do you think there's still that feeling that if I have Fido and, I don't want to see him cut up, there would still be that fervor if the public knew, correct?
No question. And in fact, as I was reviewing the records for these 70 dogs, the whistleblower provided us a lot of information about these dogs. And I was able to see how these dogs wound up at the shelter. And a number of them were lost. Animal control officers in this parish in Louisiana just picked up the dogs, brought them to the shelter. These are someone's lost dog, and 5 days later, they were sold to Louisiana State University and killed in a training lab. So, I mean, it is still happening. It's happening at Louisiana State University. There may be some other places that it's happening that just haven't had a whistleblower yet, haven't had someone work at the shelter who opposes it, who contacts PETA.
And yet, as you were saying, because it's a shelter, sometimes it's not always that easy to trace back the identity of the dog, right?
Well, look at the example I just described. It's a lost dog. And maybe that owner of that dog didn't know to check the right shelter, hadn't checked the shelter in 5 days. We don't know where that dog belonged to. Some of the dogs had collars who were sold to Louisiana State University. So, I mean, obviously these were people's pets. And to this day, they may not know what happened to their dog. They may not know that they wound up in a laboratory. And that kind of makes people's stomachs turn to think that if my dog gets out of my fence or out of my yard, that I have to worry that they're going to be sold to Louisiana State University Veterinary School for a lethal anatomy lab. That shouldn't be an anxiety that's on people's minds at all when they're already dealing with the incredible stress of losing their companion animal.
So when you talk about the fate of these dogs, these specific dogs at LSU, when they were taken from the shelter and sold to LSU, what did you find that they were subjected to at LSU?
Good question. And it's still sort of an open question that we haven't definitively answered. We do know, just based on piecing together the emails that I've read, the internal emails, that at least most of the dogs were used in an anatomy lab at the veterinary school, a lethal anatomy lab. They put them under and euthanized them. It appears to be the same day they purchased them. So it looks like that's what most of the dogs are used for. However, I did see this one disturbing email. And, when we filed our legal complaints with the USDA, I made sure to bring this to their attention. There was at one point that the shelter sold 4 dogs who had already been neutered to Louisiana State University. And it appears because this anatomy lab covers things like understanding sexual organs, they couldn't use these dogs in the anatomy lab because they had been neutered. And so the representative from Louisiana State University said, don't worry about it. Other departments made use of those dogs. And that's all it says. And I don't know what that means. What kinds of experiments those dogs were subjected to. And, shockingly to me, the shelter didn't even ask the other people in the shelter. They didn't ask or they didn't even care. The shelter was getting $40 for every live dog they sold to Louisiana State University. On top of that, the shelter was marking these animals as released or adopted. So the shelter kind of had this perverse incentive to just keep selling dogs to Louisiana State University because they got a little bit of money out of it, and also it made their statistics look good. And so it kind of had this system with really perverse incentives were going on here and allowing a really shameful practice to continue.
Well, $40 a dog, that's just under $3,000 they got. And,
right.
And then but probably the padding of the numbers saying, hey, look, we not got rid of them, but did they put them out as adopted?
They did. So in fact, to this day, listeners can go online. There's a website called adoptapet.com. I have nothing against that website. It's a great website that encourages people to adopt animals, which I encourage people to do too. But the shelter in question, Companion Animal Alliance, actually marked one of the dogs, Cajun, as adopted. You can still see it to this day on the website. It shows Cajun adopted. And we know from internal records that Cajun, this dog, was sold to Louisiana State University and used in a deadly training lab. But from the shelter's perspective, because they didn't euthanize that animal in the shelter, they called that animal an adoption. And to me, that kind of just cooking your books and fabricating statistics is an inexcusable act of deception. I mean, shelters need to be honest with the public about what's going on and the fact that we have an overpopulation crisis. And if we're manipulating and cherry picking the data and giving people a falsely rosy picture, then I worry that we're not going to address the root causes of euthanasia in shelters, which is the overpopulation crisis. So, the way I view it, I think the shelter in Louisiana State University issue is an interesting intersection between these two problems, where you have a lot of pressures being put on shelters to, inflate and distort their figures. At the same time, you have laboratories trying to find cheap sources of animals. And you combine those two things and you get a really unsavory outcome.
Yeah. And then you think about all the shelters that have adopted no kill. I don't want to say it's an outright fraud to say no kill, because it just doesn't do what they say they do. And it actually exacerbates the problem of, unadopted or, the overpopulation problem. But here's a shelter that is a normal shelter, right?
Yep, they are an open admission shelter.
And I guess when it comes down to what they would do ordinarily, they would euthanize these animals, right?
They would in many cases. And I mean, that is a sad reality of the overpopulation crisis. The way to solve that, though, is, to create a no birth nation where we have spaying and neutering and widespread adoption. Ferreting animals out the back door to a laboratory where they're going to be killed anyway is a rather macabre solution to this problem, I would say.
I'm not trying to feel empathy for the people who perpetrated this, but trying to understand them, they would say,
sure,
well, we'd kill these animals anyway through euthanasia. Here we get $3,000 for these animals by selling them to LSU. Plus, we get to make it look like we let them adopt these animals. It was almost like, if you're unethical, it was too good to be true. And if you're honest, you would say it is too good to be true. Let's perish the thought. Let's just go about our business and not deal with LSU, right?
Right. And I mean, the way I view it is I just think it betrays the fundamental spirit or mission of any responsible shelter, which is supposed to be a last safe haven for these animals. I mean, by the same, rationale that you just put forward, a shelter could say, we're just going to release our animals to dogfighting operations. We'll sell them to dogfighting operations, make a little bit of money, make our numbers look good, because then we don't have to euthanize those animals. And hey, maybe some of those dogs survive dogfighting anyway. But to me, this is a grotesque sort of way to address this problem. I mean, the way we address this problem is by solving it at the roots, by widespread spaying and neutering, increasing awareness of adoptions, cracking down on breeders, pet stores, those kinds of things. We don't do it by papering over the problem and putting animals in the hands of more abusers so that the shelters don't have to do the dirty work. And so I think that's kind of what we have here, is we have a case of conflicting missions. The mission of the shelter is supposed to be to help and save animals. Mission of the laboratory is to kill animals for an anatomy lab. And those are just not compatible.
Yeah. So who gets charged here? You filed a complaint with the Department of Agriculture and another criminal complaint. Was there some kind of collusion between the Companion Animal Alliance, which was the community animal shelter, and LSU? Or do you charge LSU for coming in and buying these animals under the guise of adoption? Or is it the shelter? You go after the shelter?
So we have two separate complaints with authorities right now. The first one is a USDA complaint over the Animal Welfare Act. And the USDA only has the authority to come down on the laboratory, which would be Louisiana State University, because they're the regulated entity here. And what we've asked the USDA to do is, we think for each of these 70 dogs, we think that they broke the law twice. They broke the law once by just buying the animals, period, because the Animal Welfare Act says you can only purchase dogs and cats from a USDA licensed source. And then they violated the law again because they didn't maintain the proper paperwork for these animals. They're supposed to keep their intake records, their disposition records, basic information so the USDA knows how many animals are going in and out of there. And it appears, based on our records request, that they didn't do any of that. They just brought in the dogs alive and then killed them for their anatomy lab and never produced any paperwork at all on Louisiana State University's side. So that's our first complaint. The USDA could, the maximum penalty they can assess per violation is a little over $11,000. That's in the statute or in the regulations. And so we think this case is so extreme that it justifies the maximum penalty for all 140 of these violations. And it should send a message to research facilities around the country that you can't do this anymore. This is a statute that's been on the books now for about 50 years. They should have all got the memo here that you can't buy dogs and cats from a shelter and use them in deadly training labs or experimentation. So that's the USDA complaint. The second component is an open records issue, because there were some records and emails that we know Louisiana State University and the shelter had between each other, but Louisiana State University did not produce them for us in response to our records request. And we know that they exist because our whistleblower gave them to us. So it appears to us that Louisiana State University may be concealing some information here. They probably didn't know that we had it through another source, through this whistleblower. So they suppressed the release of that information. And Louisiana state law says you can't do it. You can't do that. So if they really did do that, that's actually even potentially a criminal offense that the Louisiana State University, whoever was responsible for suppressing the release of those records, if it's true that they did that and it was sort of a willful attempt to conceal, that could be a very serious violation of Louisiana open records law. So we've asked the district attorney in that parish to look into that matter separately.
Now, a lot of people, they're looking at stuff in real life and then they're considering this story. When you say maximum charges in the USDA case of, say, $11,000 per count and 140 instances, that's some real money.
It's over $1 million, I think, actually.
Over $1 million. Well, that's serious. And that's something to open people's eyes and say, yeah, this is real, especially a law that's been on the books since 1966. But now the criminal charge, might there be people who say, oh, look, we can make this go away. It's not that big a deal. But why is it a big deal, you think?
Well, it's a big deal because the only way that democracy works is if people are well informed about what their government is doing. And if it's true, as our complaint says might be true, and it's a little hard to know without the district attorney doing their own probe, which is what we want them to do. But if it's true that you had employees of LSU who were acting to conceal their activities from the public, and in fact, one of the people who was corresponding with the shelter, we pointed this out in our complaint as well, was using her personal Gmail account to do it instead of her official LSU email. Right. In fact, all of her emails with the shelter were using her personal Gmail. And in our experience working on transparency issues and laboratory issues over many, many years, we find that when you're using your personal email for official business, that's often a red flag that you're trying to evade transparency and records laws. And so you kind of put the whole picture together, and it just looks like there's an operation here that maybe they knew ran afoul of the Animal Welfare Act, and so they tried to undertake some efforts to conceal it. And if that's the case, that's a really serious matter that I do think justifies a district attorney investigation and potentially charges.
If it creates an ongoing process where this is it becomes a viable source for LSU, it's illegal and they should know about it. And basically we're talking about the rule of law. We're talking about the use of personal email in a public or governmental activity or something that's public, certainly. And aren't these themes that we are seeing at the very highest levels of government right now?
Yes, unquestionably.
Yeah. I mean, the rule of law is something that you can't shirk and say, well, maybe it's not that important. Maybe it's just some dogs. Oh, it's just a few animals, right? I mean, rule of law, that's what makes our country different from other countries where you have autocratic rule or where you don't have democracy. The rule of law is that important. So
it is. And so is accountability. And I think when it comes to the operation of our government agencies, if you don't have transparency, you don't have accountability because we don't even know what they're doing. We don't even know what they're doing with taxpayer funds. And so whenever you catch an occasion where it's possible government employees are trying to conceal their activities or going rogue, I guess you could say, that needs to be extinguished as quickly as possible in one way or another. And, I don't know what the final form of that is going to take. I mean, the district attorney, it's possible they investigate and say, oh, it looks like this was an innocent mistake. Someone just forgot to produce these emails, but they had them and it was just a mistake. Or they investigate and say, yes, based on some interviews we did, it looks like there was an effort to conceal, and that's going to be handled through our judicial system or our justice system. And if that's how that's handled, then that's what's needed. But ultimately, it's in the district attorney's hands now.
All right, so let's look at this case now. The shelters, it's still running. The executive director, what's happened? The former executive director, what's happened to her? And LSU, what is it doing in relation to the shelter right
The shelter in the middle of October asked the former executive director to resign after she refused to sign on to a, quote, performance improvement plan that required her continued cooperation with Louisiana State University. They asked for her to resign almost immediately after that. And, it was obvious that the shelter, I think, didn't see anything wrong from their perspective with this whole operation. I think that all changed last week when we went public with this whole case. We worked with a Times-Picayune reporter who was interested in covering this issue, put out a story that gives a very good overview, very fair story of this whole problem. And I just noticed on their social media accounts that this story kind of went viral. I mean, it was getting hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of comments and shares. People were outraged. And almost immediately after the story came out, the shelter announced that they would no longer provide live animals to Louisiana State University. And while that's a very good sign, and this news just came out on Friday, or just a few days ago, and we still have some concerns about even the providing of cadavers. And specifically, our concern kind of goes back to that conflicting missions thing. We want to make sure that the shelter is not acting as a, clearinghouse of laboratory supplies for Louisiana State University. And whenever Louisiana State University puts in a purchase order request, that they're rounding up some dogs and euthanizing them to sell. And so we still worry that kind of partnership is going to create some distorted incentives and mission conflict. But it's still a huge sign of progress. I mean, I think that the public outrage finally brought about at least some change here. And I'm hopeful that in the coming days and weeks, we're going to see even more changes.
But you got the shelter to admit that it had done this, that it had provided dogs to LSU.
That's right. I mean, they had to. I mean, they had basically been caught red-handed. The internal records that the whistleblowers provided us, the email communications the Louisiana State provided us, painted a pretty clear picture that this was happening. I mean, we had pictures of dogs. We had, ID numbers of dogs. We had dates and times and places. We had just too many specifics for them to even attempt to claim this wasn't happening. So they did admit they were doing it. They said they no longer do it. And, our next job here is to make sure Louisiana State University doesn't try to find another willing shelter. But I kind of doubt that will happen, to be honest, because, the other shelters will see how this shelter took a beating in the press, a deserved beating, and that may make them shy away from becoming a partner with a laboratory, which is something a shelter should just never do.
And there should be maybe legal consequences as well. I mean, they're still not free of that.
Yep, and that's one thing that we also brought to the district attorney's attention is that there's potential implications here of fraud statutes. Now, this is not an area of law that I pretend to be an expert on, and which is sort of why we are just asking the district attorney to do their job looking into this. But from our perspective, you take a photograph of an animal like Cajun, upload them onto a website, and it says, "I found my new home, adopted." Well, I think that the public and maybe some of the donors of that shelter have a different conception of their mind of what adopted in a new home is than the steel table of an anatomy lab where you're dead. And so I think that may be a fraud that they're kind of perpetrating on the public.
You have to say that this is an unusual whistleblower case because things seem to be coming together quickly. I mean, you have the goods, it was verified, the whistleblower was credible. They can't really attack the whistleblower. But how rare is this kind of case? Or is this the kind of case you often see?
I will say it's special when you have a whistleblower who was as courageous and also meticulous, frankly, as this one was. I mean, she kept pretty detailed notes. She had a lot of records she could provide for us. And she was willing to go on the record and speak to media. All of that is fairly rare. It's very common that we get whistleblower complaints from someone who's like, I worked at this place 6 months ago, and I saw all this horrible stuff. No, I didn't keep any notes. No, I didn't take any photographs. And that becomes very hard because lots of times those laboratories will just say, oh, this was a disgruntled employee. They don't know what they're talking about. It becomes this kind of he said, she said sort of situation. And you also very frequently see whistleblowers who say, I want to give you this information, but I refuse to put my name on it or sign an affidavit attesting to its authenticity or I refuse to speak to the press, any of those things. Partially understandably. I mean, I have to tell you, there are many stories of people who become whistleblowers, and the post-whistleblower story often does not end well. I mean, sometimes they wind up suffering some serious repercussions professionally and personally as well. So whistleblowers really do take a very courageous action when they come forward publicly. They put themselves on the line, and I'm really thankful to this person who did that, because without them, I don't think we could have achieved what we've already achieved.
Yeah, and of course, we haven't mentioned one of the things that is important to mention when it comes to animal testing, especially when it comes to dogs. Now, we don't know exactly how these dogs are used in most cases, or I guess maybe you do. They're using anatomical, some kind of live anatomy survey. Were any of these dogs used in research that could have amounted to something in terms of, say, curing some kind of human disease, or correlates with something that would benefit mankind?
So it's important to remember that today we're studying disease on a microscopic level. In almost every case, we're looking at protein-protein interactions. We're looking at genetic differences. And when you look at it on that level, the similarities between humans and other animals starts to break down. And there's no question that we're similar to other animals in a lot of ways. I mean, that's why I'm an animal rights activist and a vegan, is I think I'm similar to other animals in all the important ways that matter. But when it comes to how the pathology of a disease plays out, or the response of a drug, those are pretty different from one species to another. And so just because a substance or a drug looks safe in a dog doesn't mean it will be in human, and vice versa. So researchers who have really studied this, and they've done a meta-analysis to look at comprehensively how evidence-based is the use of animal models in experimentation. Over and over and over again, they find that this is a failed methodology, especially now in the 21st century. I must also stress that with Louisiana State University, they refuse to provide us with even the titles of the projects that these dogs are being used in. We did request that in our records request, just the title. This is like a one-sentence summary of how these dogs are being used. And so we still don't even know how to evaluate how legitimate, I guess you could say, scientifically legitimate, the uses are of these dogs, because we know only the barest details, especially those dogs that I mentioned earlier who were sold to or used by other departments. We don't even know what departments those are. We don't know how they were used. There's some huge questions there. The Louisiana State University, I think, needs to come public with and do some explaining, because we still don't know what that even means.
And so what does the reticence of LSU tell you? That these experiments are far more heinous or useless, or what would you hazard a guess?
For one thing, I think it's important to remember that the animal experimentation community in many ways is pretty tight-knit, and there's a whole industry here. And they often have a siege mentality. I very rarely see a laboratory just take accountability, say, we made a mistake here, looks like some regulations may have been broken, but we've implemented some safeguards, to make sure what was described here didn't happen again. They almost never do that. They circle the wagons. They say everything we did was lawful, which is what Louisiana State University is claiming here. And they do everything they can to dig their heels in and fight back progress. So nothing about that surprises me, to be honest. I mean, I think whenever we release one of our big cases or investigations or issues relating to a laboratory use of animals, I think I can pretty much write the script of what the laboratories are going to say to defend themselves. It's the same old tired talking points, but I think, fortunately, more and more of the public is coming around to our side. You have a majority of Americans now who oppose all use of animals in experimentation. So eventually, I think that the social pressure and just the forces of progress are going to become so overwhelming that there's going to have to be some serious changes in these laboratories.
Well, Jeremy Beckham, thank you very much for joining us on the PETA Podcast, and we'll check back with you to make sure that the DA down there in Louisiana is following up, and how the USDA is following up, going after not just the shelter, but LSU.
Thank you so much, Emil.
PETA's Jeremy Beckham of the Laboratory Investigations Department on how a whistleblower exposed the practice of LSU Vet School buying shelter dogs, but not for companionship, but for research. The public pressure PETA applied helped end the practice, but there's still a legal fight to make sure the school is held accountable. It's a reminder of how important whistleblowers are to make sure we can shine a light on illegal abusive practices. If you see something where you are, and when it comes to animals, go to PETA.org and blow the whistle yourself. For links to more information, go to their show notes or to PETA.org. That's our program for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or at AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.